The cathedral bells of Notre Dame have rung out across Paris for over 850 years. Through plague, revolution, and two world wars, their bronze voices called the faithful to prayer. But on an ordinary Tuesday morning in 2019, as flames consumed the ancient timber roof, something more than wood and stone was burning. The images that flashed across millions of screens worldwide captured the end of an era most people hadn't even realized was ending. Across the English Channel, a different kind of silence had already settled over Britain. In 2001, for the first time in recorded history, more British people identified as non-religious than Christian. The nation that once sent missionaries to every corner of the globe now struggles to fill its own pews. Medieval churches that witnessed centuries of baptisms, weddings, and funerals now serve as art galleries, concert halls, and luxury apartments. Walk through the cobblestone streets of Copenhagen on any Sunday morning, and you'll find something remarkable: emptiness. Denmark, once the heartland of Lutheran Christianity, now boasts the highest rates of atheism in the world. Nearly 80% of Danes describe themselves as non-religious, despite their taxes funding a state church that employs more people than most multinational corporations. This isn't the story of one country losing its faith. It's the story of an entire continent walking away from beliefs that shaped Western civilization for 2 millennia. From the fjords of Norway to the hills of Tuscany, from the beer halls of Munich to the cafes of Amsterdam, Europe has quietly undergone the most dramatic religious transformation in human history. And as church attendance plummets and cathedrals echo with the footsteps of tourists rather than worshippers, a troubling question emerges. Is America next? America. The numbers tell a story that would have seemed impossible to previous generations. In Sweden, only 2% of the population attends church regularly. In the Czech Republic, 72% claim no religious affiliation whatsoever. Even in Ireland, the country that exported Catholic missionaries worldwide, weekly mass attendance has dropped from 90% in the 1970s to just 18% today. The same nation where people once walked barefoot through bogs to attend illegal masses during British rule now sees priests celebrating Sunday service for congregations of a dozen elderly parishioners. But here's what makes this transformation truly remarkable. It happened without revolution, without persecution, without the dramatic upheavals that typically accompany such massive social change. No armies marched through Europe demanding the closure of churches. No dictators issued edicts banning prayer. Instead, faith simply faded. Like morning mist disappearing as the sun rises, 2,000 years of Christian Europe evaporated in the span of a single human lifetime. To understand how this happened, we need to travel back to a cold February morning in 1945. The Red Army was closing in on Berlin, American forces were crossing the Rhine, and in the bombed-out cities across Europe, survivors emerged from their shelters to confront a landscape of devastation that defied comprehension. The war that had just ended wasn't merely a conflict between nations. It was a spiritual crisis that shook the foundations of European faith. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, uncomfortable questions echoed through the ruins. Where was God during the systematic murder of 6 million Jews? How could a continent that had been Christian for centuries produce such evil? The theological answers that had sustained believers through centuries of plague, famine, and war suddenly seemed inadequate when confronted with the industrial efficiency of genocide. But the real earthquake was still to come. As Europe rebuilt itself from the ashes, something unprecedented began to happen. Ordinary people started to prosper. The post-war economic miracle transformed societies where most people had lived at subsistence level for centuries into modern welfare states where basic needs were guaranteed. For the first time in human history, large populations could live comfortable, secure lives without depending on divine providence for their next meal. The Swedish sociologist discovered something fascinating when he studied this transformation. In traditional societies, he found religious belief served a crucial psychological function. It provided comfort and meaning in the face of existential uncertainty. When you didn't know if your crops would survive the next drought, when childhood diseases killed half of all children before age 5, when war, famine, and plague could destroy your life without warning, faith offered something precious: hope and explanation in an unpredictable world. But what happens when that uncertainty disappears? When comprehensive healthcare systems ensure that your children will live to adulthood? When social safety nets guarantee housing and food? When insurance policies protect against catastrophic loss? Suddenly, the psychological needs that religion had fulfilled for millennia were being met by secular institutions. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The generation that lived through World War II, the generation that had witnessed the ultimate failure of European civilization, made a conscious decision. They would build societies so secure, so prosperous, so rational, that their children would never experience the suffering they had endured. They succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, but they didn't anticipate the unintended consequence. Their children wouldn't need God. The 1960s brought the visible manifestation of this deeper transformation. The sexual revolution, the rise of feminism, the student protests that swept from Berkeley to Berlin. These weren't causes of Europe's religious decline. They were symptoms of a society that had already begun to question traditional authority. When young Europeans challenged the sexual teachings of the Catholic Church, they weren't rebelling against God. They were rebelling against institutions that seemed increasingly irrelevant to their lived experience. Meanwhile, something else was happening that would prove even more devastating to European Christianity. Education was becoming universal. For centuries, religious institutions had maintained their authority partly through their monopoly on literacy and learning. The village priest wasn't just a spiritual guide, he was often the only person in the community who could read Latin, who understood astronomy, who could explain natural phenomena that seemed miraculous to illiterate peasants. But as European governments invested massively in public education, secular knowledge began to displace religious explanation. Evolution replaced creation stories in biology classes. Psychology offered new ways to understand human behavior that didn't require concepts of sin and salvation. Historical criticism revealed that beloved religious texts had complex human origins that challenged traditional beliefs about divine inspiration. By the 1970s, a new kind of European was emerging, highly educated, economically secure, politically free, and increasingly skeptical of claims that couldn't be scientifically verified. These weren't angry atheists raging against God. They were people for whom religious questions had simply become irrelevant. The Catholic Church, recognizing the crisis, attempted dramatic reforms with the Second Vatican Council. Latin masses gave way to vernacular services, folk guitars replaced Gregorian chant, and priests tried to connect with modern congregations by embracing contemporary culture. But these changes often backfired spectacularly. Instead of making Catholicism more relevant, they made it seem desperate. An ancient institution awkwardly trying to keep up with trends it didn't understand. The Protestant churches faced an even more complex challenge. Without the hierarchical structure of Catholicism, they fragmented into countless denominations, each trying to find its own response to secularization. Some embraced liberal theology, effectively becoming social service organizations with a thin religious veneer. Others retreated into fundamentalism, creating insular communities that seemed increasingly disconnected from mainstream European culture. But the most devastating blow to European Christianity came from an unexpected source: prosperity itself. Religious sociologists noticed something remarkable in the data. As European countries became wealthier, their populations became less religious with mathematical precision. Countries with the highest standards of living consistently showed the lowest rates of religious belief and practice. Denmark provides perhaps the most striking example. Danish society offers its citizens universal healthcare, free education through university, generous unemployment benefits, and comprehensive social services. The result? Danes report the highest levels of happiness and life satisfaction in the world, but they also show the lowest levels of religious belief. When asked why they don't attend church, most Danes don't express hostility toward religion. They simply can't understand why anyone would need it. This correlation between prosperity and irreligion initially puzzled researchers. Shouldn't grateful people want to thank God for their blessings? But deeper investigation revealed the mechanism at work. Religious belief, it turns out, thrives on a particular kind of uncertainty, the uncertainty that comes from dependence on forces beyond human control. When societies develop institutions that minimize that uncertainty, the psychological pressure that drives people toward religious explanations and religious comfort begins to dissipate. I'm curious, where are you watching this from? And what time is it there? Are you seeing these same changes in your own community? Or does faith still play a central role where you live? Let me know in the comments. The transformation wasn't uniform across Europe. Mediterranean countries like Italy and Spain maintained higher levels of religious identification longer than their northern neighbors. But even there, the changes were dramatic. Italian Catholics who rarely attended Mass but still identified as Catholic created a new category: cultural Christianity. They baptized their children, celebrated religious holidays, and got married in churches, but treated these as cultural rather than spiritual practices. The Protestant countries of Northern Europe showed the most dramatic declines, perhaps because Protestantism had always emphasized personal faith over institutional loyalty. When individual belief eroded, there were fewer cultural anchors to maintain religious identity. A German who stops believing in God has little reason to continue calling himself Lutheran. An Italian who stops believing might still identify as Catholic because Catholicism is woven into the fabric of Italian identity. Eastern Europe presented yet another pattern. After the fall of communism, many predicted a great religious revival as people reclaimed the faith that had been suppressed under atheist regimes. In some countries, particularly Poland, this did occur. But in others, especially the Czech Republic and East Germany, the opposite happened. 70 years of enforced atheism had broken the transmission of religious culture between generations. When freedom of religion returned, many Eastern Europeans discovered they had no religious traditions to return to. The most poignant symbol of this transformation might be found in the small villages scattered across rural Europe. Ancient stone churches that have stood at the heart of these communities for 1,000 years now struggle to find priests to say Mass. In Ireland, a country with a seminary on every hilltop just 50 years ago, the average age of priests is now over 70. In France, more churches close each year than Starbucks opens. These aren't just buildings becoming obsolete, they're the visible markers of a civilization changing its fundamental character. Yet something interesting began happening in the late 20th century that complicated the narrative of European secularization: immigration. Millions of Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, and Christians from Africa, Asia, and Latin America began settling in European cities, bringing with them vibrant religious traditions that stood in stark contrast to the secular culture of their new homes. The result created fascinating contradictions. In London today, more people attend mosque on Friday than attend Anglican services on Sunday. In Paris, Islamic prayer fills the streets around mosques every week while Catholic churches stand nearly empty. This immigration-driven religious revival highlighted just how thoroughly indigenous European populations had abandoned their ancestral faiths. But it also created new tensions. Secular Europeans who had grown comfortable living in societies where religious questions were essentially settled suddenly found themselves confronting neighbors whose entire worldview was organized around religious principles. The clash wasn't between different religions, it was between religious and post-religious worldviews. These tensions exploded into public view with a series of controversies: Danish cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad, French laws banning religious symbols in schools, German debates over mosque construction, British struggles with religious courts. Each controversy revealed the same underlying dynamic. European societies that had moved beyond religion were struggling to accommodate populations for whom religion remained central to identity and community life. The data from this period reveals something fascinating about the relationship between religious diversity and religious belief. Contrary to what many expected, increased religious diversity in European cities didn't lead to religious revival among secular Europeans. Instead, it seemed to reinforce their conviction that religion was primarily a source of social conflict. The more secular Europeans witnessed religious disputes between different Muslim sects, between progressive and conservative Christians, between various immigrant religious communities, the more convinced they became that they had made the right choice in abandoning religious belief altogether. Now, let's pause here for a moment. If you're finding this deep dive into European secularization as fascinating as I am, and if these insights are giving you new perspective on one of the most important cultural transformations of our time, consider leaving a super thanks. It really helps channels like Professor Archive continue bringing you these detailed historical analyses. Back to our story. By the turn of the 21st century, the transformation of Europe was essentially complete. The continent that had sent missionaries to convert the world, that had fought religious wars for centuries, that had built its greatest art and architecture in service of Christian faith, had become the world's first post-Christian civilization. But this raised an obvious question for observers across the Atlantic. Could the same thing happen in America? On the surface, American religion in the year 2000 looked remarkably robust compared to its European counterpart. Church attendance remained high, religious identification was nearly universal, and faith played a prominent role in public life. Politicians ended speeches with "God bless America." The dollar bill proclaimed, "In God we trust," and the vast majority of Americans told pollsters they believed in God. But beneath this surface, subtle cracks were beginning to appear that mirrored the early stages of European secularization. Young Americans were attending church less frequently than their parents. Religious identification, while still high, was beginning to show the first signs of decline. Most significantly, the number of Americans who described themselves as having no religion was starting to grow. The parallels to Europe's experience were initially dismissed by many observers. America, they argued, was different. American religion was more diverse, more voluntary, more innovative than European state churches had been. American faith traditions had already survived the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and the social upheavals of the 20th century. Surely they could adapt to whatever challenges the new millennium might bring. But then something unexpected happened. The Internet. The World Wide Web, which became widely accessible to ordinary Americans in the mid-1990s, created the same kind of access to information and alternative worldviews that European universities had provided to their students decades earlier. Suddenly, isolated believers in conservative religious communities could access scholarly criticism of their faith traditions, scientific explanations that challenged religious teachings, and online communities of people who had left similar religious backgrounds. The effect was particularly dramatic among young Americans who had grown up in fundamentalist Christian households. Previous generations of religious doubters had often remained in their faith communities simply because they had no alternative social networks. But the internet allowed them to connect with like-minded people anywhere in the world, providing the social support necessary to leave religious communities that had once seemed inescapable. At the same time, American society was becoming more prosperous and more educated, the same two factors that had driven European secularization. The generation coming of age in the early 2000s was the most educated generation in American history, with college attendance becoming the norm rather than the exception. They were also benefiting from an unprecedented period of economic growth that provided levels of security and comfort that their grandparents could never have imagined. But the real catalyst for American religious change came from an unexpected source: religious overreach. In their enthusiasm to influence American politics, many religious leaders made the same mistake their European counterparts had made decades earlier. They tied their credibility to political positions and cultural battles that would ultimately prove unsustainable. The clerical abuse scandals that rocked the Catholic Church beginning in 2002 provided the most dramatic example. Americans who had trusted religious authorities with their children discovered that those authorities had systematically covered up sexual abuse for decades. The resulting loss of institutional credibility extended far beyond the Catholic Church to religious institutions in general. Protestant evangelicals faced their own credibility crisis when their leaders became increasingly identified with partisan politics. Young Americans who had been raised in evangelical churches found themselves alienated by their religious leaders' positions on issues ranging from homosexuality to environmental protection to immigration. Unlike previous generations, who might have disagreed with their pastors but remained in their churches, these young Americans had the educational tools and economic freedom to walk away. The 2008 financial crisis accelerated these trends by undermining one of the key promises of American Christianity, that faith and hard work would be rewarded with prosperity. Millions of devout Americans who had followed the rules, worked hard, and trusted God found themselves unemployed, underwater on their mortgages, and abandoned by the prosperity gospel that had promised them success. For many, it was a theological crisis that shattered their faith as thoroughly as World War II had shattered European confidence in Christian civilization. By 2012, the Pew Research Center documented something that would have seemed impossible just 20 years earlier. The fastest growing religious category in America was none, people who claimed no religious affiliation whatsoever. This wasn't just a statistical blip, it represented a fundamental shift in American culture that mirrored the European experience of the previous generation. The demographic patterns were strikingly familiar to anyone who had studied European secularization. Young Americans were abandoning religion at unprecedented rates. College-educated Americans were much less likely to be religious than those with only high school education. Urban Americans were becoming increasingly secular while rural Americans remained more religious, creating cultural and political tensions that would define American politics for the next decade. Perhaps most significantly, American women began leaving churches in large numbers. Throughout history, women had been more religious than men, providing the backbone of religious communities worldwide. But American women's increasing education and economic independence gave them the freedom to question religious teachings about gender roles that they might have previously accepted out of necessity. When women began walking away from American churches, they took their children with them, breaking the generational transmission of faith that had sustained religious communities for centuries. The COVID-19 pandemic provided an unexpected natural experiment in the importance of religious community to religious belief. When churches closed their doors and moved services online, many Americans discovered something surprising. They didn't miss going to church as much as they had expected. The habit of weekly attendance, once broken, proved difficult to restore even after churches reopened. By 2022, church attendance in America had fallen to historic lows, with many congregations reporting that they had lost 20–30% of their pre-pandemic membership permanently. But perhaps the most telling sign of America's religious transformation was generational. Polling data revealed that young Americans, those born after 1980, were abandoning religious belief at rates that surpassed even the most secular European countries. More American young adults now identify as atheist or agnostic than as evangelical Christian. Among Americans under 30, nearly 40% claim no religious affiliation whatsoever. This generational shift suggests that American secularization, unlike European secularization, might happen much more rapidly. While Europe took several generations to transition from a religious to a post-religious society, America might accomplish the same transformation in the span of a single generation. The cultural and political implications of such a rapid change are difficult to predict, but they promise to be profound. The religious communities that are thriving in contemporary America share certain characteristics that distinguish them from those that are declining. They tend to be highly demanding of their members, creating strong social bonds and clear boundaries with the secular world. They often embrace modern technology and contemporary cultural forms while maintaining traditional theological positions. Most importantly, they provide their members with something that secular society struggles to offer: transcendent meaning and genuine community. Yet even these thriving religious communities face challenges that their European counterparts encountered decades earlier. Their young people attend universities where secular worldviews predominate. They live in an economy that rewards individual achievement over communal solidarity. They are exposed to cultural messages that emphasize personal autonomy over traditional authority. The same forces that undermined European Christianity are now at work in American religious communities. The question facing America today isn't whether it will follow Europe's path toward secularization. That process is already well underway. The question is what kind of society America will become as it transitions from a religious to a post-religious culture. Will it develop the stable, prosperous, socially cohesive societies that characterize secular Europe? Or will the rapid pace of American religious decline create cultural disruption and social conflict that European societies avoided through their more gradual transformation? Early signs suggest that American secularization is creating tensions that Europe managed to avoid. The political polarization that has dominated American life in recent decades is partly a conflict between religious and secular worldviews, with each side increasingly unable to understand or respect the other's fundamental assumptions about reality. This cultural warfare was largely absent from European secularization because religious decline there happened gradually enough that society could adjust its institutions and expectations accordingly. America's religious communities also seem less willing to accept cultural marginalization than their European counterparts were. European churches generally adapted to secularization by retreating from public life and focusing on serving their remaining believers. American religious groups, by contrast, are fighting aggressively to maintain their cultural influence through political action, legal challenges, and social activism. This resistance might slow the pace of secularization, but it also creates ongoing conflict that makes American society less stable than the European societies that completed their secular transitions decades ago. The implications extend far beyond religion itself. Religious institutions in America, unlike in Europe, have historically provided crucial social services, running hospitals, schools, and charitable organizations that serve millions of people. As religious communities decline, these institutions face uncertain futures. Some will be taken over by secular organizations or government agencies, but others will simply disappear, potentially creating gaps in America's social safety net that secular institutions may struggle to fill. Perhaps most intriguingly, America's rapid secularization is happening at the same time that other parts of the world are experiencing religious revival. Christianity is growing explosively in Africa and Asia. Islam continues to expand globally, and even in supposedly secular Europe, immigrant religious communities are establishing vibrant institutions. This creates a paradox. As America becomes more secular, it also becomes more religiously diverse, potentially creating the same tensions between secular natives and religious immigrants that European countries have experienced. The story we've traced from the bombed-out churches of 1945 Europe to the empty pews of contemporary America reveals something profound about the relationship between religion and human society. Faith, it turns out, is not simply a matter of personal belief or philosophical conviction. It's intimately connected to the material conditions of human existence, the social structures that organize community life, and the psychological needs that arise from humanity's confrontation with uncertainty and mortality. In this light, the decline of religion in prosperous, educated, secure societies isn't an accident or a temporary aberration. It's a predictable response to changing human needs. When secular institutions can provide the comfort, community, and meaning that religion once monopolized, many people will choose secular alternatives. This doesn't necessarily represent moral decline or spiritual failure. It might simply reflect humanity's remarkable ability to adapt its worldviews to changing circumstances. Yet the story also reveals the continuing human hunger for transcendence, community, and purpose that secular societies struggle to satisfy fully. Even in the most secular European countries, many people report feeling something missing from their lives, a sense of higher purpose or deeper connection that material prosperity alone cannot provide. This suggests that the future might not belong entirely to either religious or secular worldviews, but to new forms of meaning-making that combine the best insights of both traditions. As we look toward the future, the question isn't whether America will become more secular. All evidence suggests it will. The question is whether American society can navigate this transformation as successfully as European societies have, creating stable, prosperous, cohesive communities that serve human needs for both security and meaning. The answer to that question will shape not just America's future, but the future of human civilization in an increasingly secular age. The bells of Notre Dame will ring again when the cathedral's restoration is complete, but they'll ring over a Paris that has fundamentally changed since that April day in 2019. They'll call to worshippers who are largely immigrants from former French colonies, tourists seeking Instagram moments, and perhaps a handful of elderly French Catholics who remember when those bells meant something more than tourist attraction. The Great Transformation is nearly complete. What we do with our post-religious world, whether we create heaven or hell on earth, remains to be written. That's Professor Archive signing off. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeking truth wherever it leads.